Hello, everyone. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate Black History Month at Harriet Tubman Institute at York University. We are holding this panel virtually because of the COVID-19. And as it is our tradition, before we start, I would like to ask Ari to read the land recognition as we do always.
Thank you, Dr. Mianda. I'm aware that the practice of reading the land acknowledgement in a forum such as this might be new to some participants in our virtual space. However, it is part of the formality we observe at York University in Glendon. It goes like this. Glendon, as part of York University, acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Tikahonto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Hello, welcome to everyone again. Thank you for being there, being here today to hear this conversation about COVID-19 vaccine. We all know that Black population is one of the most affected by this pandemic. Now that the vaccine is out there, we are lucky to hear from our own specialists, from our own community, who kindly have accepted our invitation to inform us about this vaccine. The panel today is organized by Harriet Tubman Institute in collaboration with the Canadian Multicultural Inventors Museum, with the help of Francis Jeffers, the founder and director who put together this panel, and the Toronto Black COVID Task Force, with the assistance of Dr. Akwa Keti, chair of the Black Scientist Task Force on Vaccine Equity. I would like, on behalf of Harriet Tubman Institute, to thank you for giving us today this opportunity to learn, to hear from you. And thank you very much for doing this for our community. I think it's now to Ari.
You're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Meander. And before I begin, I would just acknowledge again Dr. Kenty and Francis Jeffers. I'm not sure if he's here right now. I haven't seen him.
He's there. He's there.
Okay, thank you. Again, my name is Henry Gomez. I'm your moderator for today. Before I get underway, I think I should just introduce the members of the panel, and then I would outline how we'll proceed today. As a matter of fact, no, I reverse that. Outline how we'll proceed today. We have a very distinguished panel to share their knowledge with us. We'll go for the first hour or so, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. We have a series of questions that we'll be posing to the panelists. These questions have come from people who have sent their questions in. So I'll just take a little time to contextualize the situation, welcome you all, and then set it up, and let's have a great experience sharing knowledge and information today. Okay, so just to contextualize a bit, I would say that there's something I prepared here that I would read. I think this would go very well. So again, my name is Henry Gomez, your moderator for today's webinar, which features a panel of medical experts in the field of virology, immunology, quality and compliance, naturopathy, vaccine, and vaccine allergy. Now, as you all know, the current corona outbreak continues to have a major impact on our lives. You also know that there are conflicting schools of thought on the nature of the virus, its origin, whether it's being used as a bioweapon on a global scale, etc. All of this comes against an historical backdrop. Sorry about that. All of this comes against an historical backdrop of the indigenous peoples being smallpoxified with blankets, the Tuskegee experiment involving Blacks in the United States, reports of vaccines gone wrong in some African countries and in India, and reports of the sterilization of African women in Israel. Added to this is the debate over whether vaccines cause or contribute to autism, especially among Black boys. And added to this also is the presence of at least two prominent voices and personalities in the vaccine debate. These are Bill Gates and Dr. Fauci, as some of you may well know. Even Mark Zuckerberg, as a very prominent voice, has had his 2 cents worth to put in. And combined with all of this, we are in an environment in which information is so easily disseminated, and we have all kinds of information flowing around, and sometimes it becomes very confusing. People don't know what to believe, what not to believe, and so on. So now we see the importance of hearing from knowledgeable people with a Black perspective, hence the title of today's webinar, the COVID and Me, a Black Perspective. We know that in many, many cases, the experiences that Black people have, or people of African ancestry have, or Hamitic people, as we are sometimes referred to now, have, is quite different from people in other communities. So it becomes very, very important that we are having this webinar today. At this point, I say welcome to all of you. I know we have people from, it's internationally being viewed and being participated in. So welcome to everyone who has taken the time to join us today. At this point, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I think I'll go in the order in which they'll be presented the questions later on. So here we go. We have Dr. Zainab Abdurrahman. I hope I've pronounced the last name correctly. She's adjunct assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster University, graduate of University of Toronto Medical School, completed her pediatrics training and training in clinical immunology. She is the allergy lead in the special immunization clinic at McMaster Children's Hospital, focusing on vaccine allergy. She also practices in the community in the greater Toronto area, including Mississauga. That's Dr. Zainab Abdurrahman. We have Dr. David Burt. Dr. Burt is an immunologist with more than 30 years of international experience in the research and development of vaccines against infectious diseases, including influenza and SARS. He holds a PhD in immunology from the University of Birmingham and a bachelor's in science and biological chemistry from Essex University. He's an award-winning author with over 40 publications, published peer-reviewed scientific manuscripts, and is a Harry Jerome Award recipient, among other Canadian and international awards. That's only part of his rather extensive profile, so in the interest of time, I'll leave the rest for now. Then we go to Dr. Candice Todd, a board-certified naturopathic doctor and health educator with a passion for health promotion. In practice, she utilizes evidence-based naturopathic medicine or medical care, which focuses on treating the root causes of health concerns. I love that. Using effective natural therapies, she helps her patients to achieve their best health. You know, there's a saying, health is wealth. So it doesn't matter how much material wealth one might have, but if one's health is not intact, then the material wealth amounts to nothing. That's just a little exchange that Akwatu and I had earlier this morning. Dr. Candice completed her honors bachelor in health sciences degree at the University of Western Ontario, and from there fostered her desire to help people by completing an intense 4-year program at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine to earn her designation as Doctor of Naturopathic Medicine, Dr. Candice Todd. And last but not least, Trevor Aldridge, DSc, the Senior Director, Quality and Compliance at Brevitas Consulting, Inc., with more than 30 years industry experience, including biologies, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices. So expertise includes product and process development, analytical methods, and manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals. Previous positions: Director of Quality Operations at the Sanofic Pasteur Limited and Biologicals Specialist, Health Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience, these are our 4 distinguished panelists today. They would share their knowledge with you, and our hope is that the time you've taken to attend this webinar would be well worth it, that you will be well informed, and again, especially from a Black perspective, because again, we know that in society, all things are not the same for all peoples. We have the historical evidence to show that, and we have current evidence to show that as well. So to start things off, we have Dr. Zainab. We'll pose the first question to her. I hope that I've covered all the ground that I needed to, at least at this point. And I'm sure that if I haven't, things will come up later on and we'll be able to take care of that. So our first question goes to Dr. Abdurrahman, and it comes from, let's see, it comes from someone who says, I need to learn as much as I can before taking the vaccine. I have RA and wondering if the vaccine will create problems with the medication I'm currently on to control the RA. Dr. Abdurrahman.
Thank you. I know a lot of people who have a variety of different types of autoimmune disease, including RA, which is rheumatoid arthritis, have had concerns about the safety and the use of this in their conditions. The Rheumatological Association of Canada and of Ontario has recommended the use of the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines in their patients. Now, people who have rheumatoid arthritis can be on a lot of different kinds of medications. So, you know, for the specific ones for yourself, it's always good to talk also with your physician who's prescribing for you, just to make sure. Sometimes they might make some accommodations, but for the most part, they haven't really suggested huge changes to people's medications prior to taking the vaccine, but they have recommended the use of the vaccine to protect patients with autoimmune disease, so that they can be protected against COVID-19 infection.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abdurrahman. We may come back to this later on as we open things up and we begin discussing a bit. The second question I have goes to Dr. David Burt, and it's a bit lengthy, so I'll try to be as concise as possible.
No problem.
In terms of the vaccine, it's not that Blacks are not getting access to the vaccine. The issue is that the vaccine had not had much data regarding long-term effects. There's been a push for racialized communities to receive before whites, despite the fact that many whites do not wear masks and cough in our direction without covering their mouths. Have there been additional information on adverse effects? And this one goes to Dr. David Burt.
Okay, thank you. I think there are many parts to that question. I'll start with the idea that you know, the vaccine is targeting racialized individuals. We know that our community and other racialized communities have been impacted the most by COVID-19. So it's important for us to be aware of the benefits and the risks associated with the vaccine, because we are impacted and have been impacted more than many other communities. In terms of the clinical studies that have been done, Blacks, for an example, have made up around 9 to 10% of the population that have been participating in those clinical studies. That isn't the majority, that isn't really a focus on the Black community, but it's essential for us to know how the vaccine is working in that community, in our community. And if you think of the size of the studies that have been done, and we're talking about 30,000 subjects in each study, then 10% is a fair number. We would like to see more individuals from racialized communities in those studies, but definitely there isn't a focus on testing the vaccine in racialized individuals in order to test, to see or to impact them negatively. It's only done in order to make sure that we have good data and we can show that this vaccine is working, is safe, and is appropriate in that population. And in terms of the safety studies that have been done have been very rigorous. The safety studies that have been done on these vaccines that have been authorized is essentially the same level and criteria that many of the other vaccines have had to go through. And so these vaccines have been demonstrated to be safe in that, yes, you'll get the usual reaction at the side of the injection. You might get some fever, you might get a bit of headache, but these disappear after a few days. And the severe side effects like anaphylaxis or allergy are very, very rare. And the best data is coming from studies in the United States where the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines have been rolled out. And the side effects, the very important side effects are very rare. Something like between 1 and 10 per million. And if you compare that with the benefits of getting the vaccine, and in the United States, we know that 1 in 12 individuals test positive for the virus, and 1 in 1,000 people have died from coronavirus, COVID-19. So it's clear that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Thank you, Dr. Burt. And we know that included in the information that has been circulating, especially in the early stages of the of the outbreak, there was a rumor at one time that this was not affecting Black people, quote unquote. That I don't know whether members of the panel heard this, but this, I know that I read and heard this coming from several people, that somehow Blacks were immune to this corona outbreak. Of course, the turn of events have shown that this has not been the case, or is not the case. I will go now to Dr. Todd. And the question we have, the comment and question we have for Dr. Todd comes from someone who says, we live in a large apartment building. What are the top 5 things we need to do to protect ourselves from getting COVID? If one of us gets COVID and we don't want or can't go to an isolation hotel, what can we do to not spread COVID among ourselves? Dr. Todd?
Sure. So, you know, when you live in a sort of dense population, as with apartment buildings, vaccination might be one of the things that you want to consider to help protect yourself in terms of severity of disease. So that is one thing to consider. We also want to do those things if we are you know, exposed to somebody who has it in the building. We want to do the things like social distancing, hand hygiene, doing masks in common areas, sorry. So, you know, things like the elevator, you want to stay 6 feet apart if you can, and if you can't, wear masks in common areas. And then from my background and my sort of a holistic perspective, I would do those things that help to support the immune system. So we do also know that comorbidities like hypertension, like diabetes, impact the severity of disease. So, you know, on sort of a longer term scale, think about the things that can help to keep you healthy. So exercising, eating well, sleeping, and engaging in social, virtual social, engaging with other people socially. So keeping those connections.
All right, thank you, Dr. Todd. Now, the next question we have, I'm not sure what to make of it of a question, but I'll put forward the information, and we see what comes of it. It's rather lengthy, and here goes. Let's see. And this one is directed to Trevor. We have here, this person says, I'm scheduled to take the vaccine on February 20. That's today. My gosh. I hope the person gets the answer in time. I'm scheduled to take the vaccine on February 20th. Do I have some reservations? Yes. This is a new vaccine. Long-term effects or complications are unknown. No one can say otherwise with complete honesty, and I think Dr. Burt touched on that a minute ago. Hence my anxiety. I plan on getting the vaccine. I would also like to access this webinar after the fact, etc., etc. Well, the person essentially wants to know He's taking his 87-year-old mother to a medical appointment. He doesn't say whether she would be receiving the vaccine. He or she simply states will be taking the 87-year-old mother to a medical appointment. The key question seems to be whether the webinar will be offered after the fact. Is that really a question for one of the medical people? It seems not. That seems more like a technical question. So here's what I'll do then. For Trevor, you should be able to handle this one pretty comfortably. It might come as a surprise, but this is straightforward. The person asks, will we have an option to not take the vaccine? I posed this one to Trevor, but I think any of you might be able to pitch in. And who knows, maybe we can have a little discussion around this one. Okay, will we have an option to not take the vaccine? Trevor?
Yes. First of all, let me just say that, implied in the question that you were reading before is a question, because I think she wants to have some sense of comfort in terms of risk about taking the vaccine today, and she wants to come back and look at the information that we can probably help her with for that purpose. Okay, so let me just talk about that for a little bit first.
Okay.
So I completely understand the sentiment, and that's incontrovertible. There is a lack of information concerning the long-term effects of 2 new vaccines that are approved for emergency use. However, that is not the sum total of the information that we have. And what I can say is this: vaccines follow the same regulatory pathway as do all drugs, except that for vaccines, it's the bar is a lot higher. It's a much more rigorous process because vaccines have some inherent reasons for a rigorous process. The origin of vaccines are generally from pathogens. They tend to have a high variability. They're complex, and they're sensitive to changes in materials and in process changes. So because of those reasons, even to get to the point where you can apply for an investigational new drug application, an IND as we call it, there's a lot of information that the regulators need to see to satisfy themselves that there is good evidence that vaccine will be safe during these clinical trial stages. And in this case, because we have two vaccines that are from a brand new platform, they're both the Pfizer and BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines are from the new mRNA platform. There are some differences. So that would imply that the regulators have to have a lot more scrutiny over safety data in particular. I mean, obviously they have to look at efficacy, but the safety data is going to be very, very important in the review process. Now, these 2 vaccines are already approved for emergency use. So there would already have been a lot of information provided to the regulators. So the other point, though, is that, and Burt already alluded a little bit to this, there is already some data, and there is fairly good data up to the point where we looking at, say, back to the clinical studies that have been performed. And if I look at the Pfizer study, for example, they performed the study in phase 2-3, looking at safety and efficacy. They had 43,000 participants, and that was started back in April of 2020. And again, we're going to all the common side effects because Burt mentioned those. But again, the serious effects were obviously allergic or anaphylaxis. And by the time we looked at this data back in January, I mean, more than about 1.9 million doses had already been administered. Looking at the Moderna studies had a population of about 30,000 in that range, and it was split between a placebo group and a vaccine group, pretty much 1-to-1. What was interesting coming out of that study was that the safety concerns, the safety as looked at through through adverse events was pretty much the same. The profile was a number of non-serious adverse events and a few, I guess they considered to be rare numbers, which were for mainly anaphylaxis. So those are that's information, that's real data, that gives you some perspective on what's been happening. Now, looking at, and I have some data from, let me see now, from the data, we're looking a lot at US data because there's already a fairly significant amount of US data. And, but there is also Canadian data as well. So let me talk a little bit about, so up to January of this year, January 9th, there were about 600,000 doses administered in Jamaica and in Canada, and there were about 90 adverse events reported, and 27 were serious, and there were no safety signals identified. And then we have a little bit more of an update on data in Ontario specifically, where we had up to 373 adverse events by February 13th. 365 were non-serious, and only 8 were serious, and 2 were again anaphylaxis. So you're seeing a very clear pattern of what the adverse event profile looks like so far. Then what was really interesting though was I looked at the current CDC, that's US morbidity and mortality report as of yesterday. And one of the things that was stated by the CDC in this report was that safety monitoring of these 2 vaccines, the Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, has been the most intense and comprehensive in US history. And that is really saying quite a lot. And this is pretty much what you expect. I mean, based on the regulatory pathway that you'd expect them to follow for vaccines from a new platform, which of course there isn't that kind of a history available yet. And so the expectation is that the regulators will be applying a lot more scrutiny in looking at key aspects based on this new platform. And of course, safety is going to be one of them. What was interesting though was, to be fully transparent, there are deaths reported during some of these studies. And certainly if you look back at the, even in the February 30th report in Ontario, there were 7 deaths reported at long-term care homes that were temporarily associated with vaccine administration. However, the information, at least up to now, is that these were associated with comorbidities and were not necessarily vaccine associated, and they are still investigating those. In the US, by January 13th, there were a total of 113 deaths reported. This is just based on vaccine administration and normal process. And again, 78 of those were from long-term care homes where there were noted comorbidities. And they looked at death certificates, autopsy reports, medical records, and clinical descriptions of that did not suggest that there were any causal relationships with the vaccine. So that gives you some perspective on what's going on. But what was very interesting to note, though, was in some of the clinical studies, there were reports of deaths in placebo groups. That gives you some additional perspective. We can expect to have deaths in the placebo group as well as in the vaccine groups, but they may not be causally related to the vaccine, clearly. So this is some perspective on the existing data. And yes, it covers only up to about 10 months, a maximum of data post-vaccination. But the profile still looks somewhat the same. Of course, you're starting to see deaths for other reasons, but there are still no safety signals identified either in the US or in Canada as far as I can tell. So that's some perspective for someone who wants to make a decision around taking the vaccine and what any implied risks may be from not necessarily having data that extends back for a very long period of time.
Thank you, Trevor, for teasing out, for gleaning so much information, being able to provide so much information coming out of that statement. And maybe this is a time I could throw this open a bit, so everyone might jump in, all the panelists might jump in. I just want to follow through on some of the data you've mentioned and some of the information in general that you've put forward. Could it be that some people's anxiety has been made more intense, or could it be that anxiety has become more common among many more people because of the speed with which these vaccines have been developed? I've read that sometimes it takes as many as 10 years before a vaccine can be put through the various phases of development before it is made available made available and administered to the general public. So could it be that that's the quickness, the speed? I think it was in the US, you had the past president Donald Trump talking about warp speed. The pressure is on to develop a vaccine that would deal with this corona outbreak that has impacted our lives so completely. So maybe we can have a little discussion on that. I don't know if it's warranted, but I just put that out there because that's part of that's some of the information that has been circulating.
Well, can I make a few comments around that? Because
yes,
it's sort of important to talk about that too, because if you say a vaccine takes 10 years to develop, that does not really inform you very much.
Okay.
You need to understand what's happening in that 10-year period. So, you know, the roadmap for development, and Burt can talk a lot about the actual development phase, but the whole point of going through a fairly rigorous development phase is to get to a point where you're in a good position to submit for an IND, which means you have a lot of good solid data in which to base out future manufacturing of, if you have a viable product coming out of development, you need to be able to convert that now into something that's that you can commercialize, final product. What you need to end up with by the time you commercialize a vaccine particularly is well-controlled processes, very reliable processes that bring you consistent results. And in the vaccine world, you know, we do have a fair amount of variability to start off with. So saying that implies a lot. But what's happening in the background quite often is that the 10 years is not 10 years of high intense activity. Things tend to go in phases. And you have a lot of work to do as you go through various clinical stages. First of all, you know, and Burt can talk about this too, you have to decide, you know, okay, what kind of testing do I need to do as I get through different gates to characterize and to do things like understand safety, etc. Analytical methods that I need to develop so I can actually test the product. So all of these things take time, and they're all sort of have their own stages in the process. So you're not sort of pedaling furiously all along this time. There are times when you're just waiting for things to happen too. So the 10 years needs to be explained a little bit more carefully when you talk about the time frame. And clearly, when you talk about the new process now, you know, again, I'll leave this to Burt to talk about. There are reasons why, good reasons why the time to develop a new vaccine using this platform would be shorter, because you're cutting out a whole lot of the traditional stages in the vaccine development. You're not starting off directly with the pathogen and figuring out which antigens do I need to get from this pathogen. You're going right to a different starting point. So I'll just make those comments, and then maybe Burt can comment more on the development part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Burt.
I know Zainab is itching to go as well, but I'll just say a few things first. It's understandable why people are concerned about the speed in which these vaccines have been developed. And let's face it, it was only a year ago when we realized that really this coronavirus, well, just more than a year, this new coronavirus was so deadly, different compared to the SARS and the Middle Eastern version that was circulating previously. But a lot of the work that has been able to be transferred to this COVID-19 virus was already done with similar viruses, similar coronaviruses, SARS and the Middle Eastern virus. Individuals have been working on these viruses since 2002. many companies started to develop vaccines against SARS and the Middle Eastern version, but because these sort of disappeared, that work was stopped. But a lot of that work was reported in journals. A lot of the work was archived, and a lot of great information was developed from those studies that were transferred to COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2. And that's why that actually sped up that development. And in terms of the mRNA and DNA vaccines, I remember going to conferences in 1997 and hearing about this technology being developed for vaccines, for treating cancer. And again, this work has been fine-tuned over 15 to 20 years. So a lot of that early research phase that normally takes 5 to 10 to 15 years was actually done. And that was applied to this new coronavirus. And vaccines were able to be developed rapidly because of that previous work that was done.
Thank you. Dr. Abdurrahman, Dr. Todd, anything you'd like to contribute to this segment?
I think what's really important, I think Dr. Burt also just mentioned, is that a lot of this technology was previously present, right? So you can go back in the journals, like I think even in 1990 was when they kind of started working on this. The big issue was trying to figure out how to stabilize this type of a vaccine. And there's a lot of cost that goes into making it. So they started working on this with SARS and with MERS, but those diseases did not develop into diseases that kind of came back and started affecting multiple people. So unfortunately, money and funding did not go into continuing their development because they were not diseases that were as prominent anymore. So a lot of this technology actually had been worked on. And in fact, mRNA technology in this form is being used in cancer populations and in cancer treatments. But the question was the cost. So now we had this time period where the world was really focused on one thing, the COVID-19 infection and pandemic. So now we had an active audience who were all putting in a lot of investment because it was very expensive to make these. So a lot of times they didn't continue in their production. So now we had a lot of funding coming towards them. And they were able to focus entirely on this and take that technology and work on it at a fast speed. And so this is a culmination of probably about 30 years of work and looking at it in terms of something that was continuing. So now they had a reason to continue and work on it and focus on it. So there is that aspect. So in a sense, this has been a long time in the making. And now is the time when we've been able to really allow them to continue with that research with all the appropriate funding. It still went through all the exact same phases as any other vaccine that we have on the market. They still had to do phase 1 to show that there was safety. Phase 2, looking at how well it could work, so efficacy with still a focus on safety as well, and then making sure they had the right dose. And once that was completed, then you do phase 3, where you give that dose in a large population with a focus now, thankfully there's focus on diversity. So they also recruited for a diverse population, which is why there's about nearly 10% of Black people who are participants in both of these studies. Then they went through that, they followed them to make sure that it did reduce infection. So all these phases have been completed as well. So I think that those are important things to also mention here.
Henry, can I just add one other point? I've been involved in vaccine studies where it's been almost impossible to recruit 5,000, 10,000 people to take part in a study in less than a year or a year and a half. But because the pandemic has impacted people so much, there was so many people willing to take part in the clinical studies. So very rapidly, most of these trials have had around 30,000 individuals taking part. And the other benefits of this this period was that these trials could be done at a time when the virus was actually circulating, causing a pandemic. So it could actually measure the efficacy, how effective these vaccines were in real time, because often you might be doing a study where the actual disease isn't very rampant, so it's hard to get good data. But in this case, because the disease was so rampant, we have really strong data in terms of the efficacy. And the fact that these vaccines were shown to be, many of them more than 90% effective, demonstrates what can be done with resources and in an emergency.
Thank you.
Maybe just one quick comment, so even though you've gone through all that process to develop the vaccine and have something that's a candidate at phase 3 that you can commercialize, the actual commercialization step is a really big step too, because even if you've done all of this work at development scale, small scale, you still have to scale it up to make it a commercial product. That now shifts it into a whole different discussion, because things don't necessarily scale easily sometimes. So you have to figure all of that out. You have to do a lot of validation steps along the way. It's a ton of work that happens in the background, between getting to even phase 3 and, well, I should say phase 2 and commercialization. So there's a ton of work happening. So what I can say is that would have been a monumental effort to get a product from phase 2 to something that you could actually get approved on the emergency use authorization, because all of the controls are still expected to be there. So I can visualize people working night and day to get this done.
Thank you. And I see from the chat a question came. People are reading my mind today. I'm kind of frightened about this, but we can't ignore that the commercial aspect of this, that return on the investment, considering the financial resources that have to go in to creating vaccine. But I want to throw it to Dr. Todd at this point, because in all the debate that we've been hearing, it seems as though the vaccine is the silver bullet, the cure-all, the one and only, at least as far as I can tell. The focus has been on the vaccine, the vaccine, the vaccine. So Dr. Todd, how do you come at this as a naturopath, the only one in the group? And I'm really glad we have you here today, because this, it seems to me and to many others, that this is part of the discourse that has been absent since this corona outbreak. The emphasis on the vaccine, and I think coming up later on, I think it was Trevor who mentioned, or was it David who mentioned the difference, the mRNA and the DNA. We're going to come to that later on. But Dr. Todd, how do you come at this as a naturopath?
So yeah, I'm actually really happy to be on this panel, and I think it's sort of unprecedented to have a naturopath on a panel like this. So I'm so thankful to be on it and to add to the conversation, because I do think that a lot of people do wonder about, what are some of the things that I should be doing to support my health in general, as opposed to all I'm hearing about is vaccination. So to that, I would say vaccination is, one of the tools, and naturopaths like to use a number of different things in their toolkits when they're supporting patients with health. But vaccination is one of those things that you want to think about when you're thinking about a holistic way to protect your health. So yes, I'm going to treat somebody in terms of some of the comorbidities that they may be experiencing, because we know that for racialized communities, comorbidities are higher. And we want to obviously treat those, but we also have timelines. So when treating somebody with diabetes, let's say, who has the potential to experience this disease in a more severe way, I'm working with that patient for months and months and months, and potentially years. And when we're looking at vaccination, this is more of an immediate tool that we can utilize to help protect our health. So I do look at it from a holistic perspective in terms of supporting health, considering vaccination based on your risk factors and based on the health of your loved ones. And yeah, I guess that's my sort of where I view it.
Thank you all for this segment. I'm going to push on this a little more because it's been hinted at, especially coming from Dr. Todd, and maybe we should talk a little more about the importance of a healthy immune system, because again, this seems to be part of what has been missing from some of the debate in this focus, this emphasis on the vaccine. The importance of maintaining a healthy immune system in terms of being able to fight off or to combat in some effective way this coronavirus. And I throw it open to the panel. Maybe I could continue with Dr. Todd, and then anybody else can pick up from there.
Sure. So when we're looking at any natural healthcare product with respect to COVID, there is nothing that is evidence-based out there that can confer immunity the way that the vaccine can, so to the degree that it can. So that's something that's important to think about. Yes, there are a number of different things that you can utilize to support your immune system. And I actually encourage people to do that, because the way that vaccinations work is by triggering your immune system, and you want to have a healthy, supported immune system so that you can, confer that potential immunity or reduce the severity of disease. You want your immune system to mount an immune response, and it needs those vitamins, minerals, those nutrients to help support it. It also needs, a exercise. It also needs sleep. It also needs support for mental health. So reduce stress, things like that. So a holistic, I believe that a holistic, obviously for me, a holistic way to go about protecting the health of this community, which is especially impacted, is one that people should consider.
Thank you so much. And I believe now we're fast approaching that time at which we'll take a break. It's now 1:57 according to my clock. But maybe before we do, we'd just take a look at one more question, and that would take us into the break. This may take us till about 5 after or so. And this one goes to Dr. Abdurrahman. Does the vaccine enable the body to produce proteins to fend off COVID? That's one part of the question. If so, are there situations where the body overproduces protein, causing thickening of the blood, rare blood cancers, and others in the future? I've read it just as I've received it. Okay, I'll just go that over again. Does the vaccine, and this mainly for the benefit of the audience, does the vaccine enable the body to produce proteins to fend off COVID? I think that's linked with the immune system. I don't, okay, if so, are there situations where the body overproduces protein, causing thickening of the blood, rare blood cancers, and others in the future? Dr. Abdurrahman.
Thank you for that question. It's great to know kind of what people are concerned about when it comes to the vaccines. So you're correct. The way the vaccine works is your body, your immune system is going to get exposed to seeing the spike protein, which is a small portion of the COVID-19 virus, and then your body is going to make antibodies to it. So there'll be kind of that acute response, and then there'll be a long-term response. Now, what happens is we do this every day, all the time we're doing this. So whenever we're exposed to a cold virus, or we get a stomach bug, anytime like that, our body actually sees these pathogens and we make antibodies to them. And then what happens is we make these antibodies, we deal with, if it's a true infection, we deal with the infection at that time. In this case, your body makes these antibodies, and then there's no actual infection. So then what happens is we make memory cells. And these memory cells, they're these memory B cells, they live in our bodies. And what they do is they're ready if we see that happen again. If we see that particular type of infection try to breach our borders, then they're able to rapidly and quickly produce those antibodies once again. So it's not that, you're going to have some of them circulating, but it's actually the ability for you to be able to produce lots of the antibodies if you see that same type of infection again, but you will still have some level of that antibody. And that happens to us, happens with vaccines, but it also happens when you're exposed to various pathogens. So, the common cold, although people think of it as one virus, it's like over 200 viruses give you those kind of cough, cold, runny nose, and then we make some antibodies to it. And so we constantly are doing this with any times that we actually interact with some kind of a pathogen breaching our walls, essentially. So that is what happens. We make these antibodies, and then we have the ability to produce them rapidly and quickly if we do get infection, to kind of quell it and not allow the infection to take hold of our cells. Typically, the amount that we're producing, it's not very high. It's actually not going to in any way kind of thicken your blood in any way. So the amount of, if you look at the proteins in our blood, the smallest bump, like sometimes we can break it down, the smallest amount of the proteins in our blood is actually these immunoglobulins, which are what help us fight disease. So they're actually the least amount of protein in your blood. So from that perspective, there wouldn't be kind of that concern. And from kind of what we've seen from the data as well, we haven't really seen any signals like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now let us, let's probe a little more, because we have, I'm pretty sure we have quite a mix, let's say, of mixed levels of informed people, from academia to non-academia and so on. One of the topics that come up is the difference now, excuse me, as you mentioned, the spike protein. Would anyone care to explain, describe for the benefit of the audience, of course, the mRNA, that messenger, because that's been the cause of a lot of debate as well. I see Dr. Abdurrahman nodding and smiling, so go with it.
Sure. I mean, I've had this question a lot of times, and I do understand why people are concerned. So I'm going to answer this, and I'm actually going to, before I answer it, I'm going to answer another question that I've seen in the chat and also in the question and answer, which is, have we fully isolated this virus? And the answer is yes. We have isolated this virus, and this has been actually done for ages. And the whole, structure in terms of its molecular makeup is known in terms of the genome of it. So that is available, and that's how we're actually able to make any of these vaccines. And so what happens is, as humans, we are kind of a production of our DNA. So everyone's very comfortable and knows what DNA is and how that kind of imprints as to who we are. Our DNA lives within our cells, and it's highly protected. So there's a nucleus in your cell, which is like a highly protected, think of it as like almost like the Pentagon. And within it, there's like an even like smaller area that's super protected, which is called the nucleolus. And that's where our DNA lives. Whenever we want to make proteins, we need a blueprint as to how to make it. So then our DNA says, okay, I'm not leaving here. This is protected. I'm going to give you a copy, and this gives you the instructions. And then that is taken out, and then you make proteins. But once that's done, that is called messenger RNA. Once that blueprint is out there, once it's done making a protein, it gets disintegrated. So it gets targeted by everybody. Oh, there's RNA just hanging out in the cell, kill it, get rid of it, it's done its job. But it can never go back into it. So in humans, this messenger RNA, which takes a blueprint how to make something, it's just a piece of paper. It can't go back. So it can't go back into our DNA and get incorporated into the DNA. It's a one-way production in humans. Okay, so with that, now in the vaccine, you're getting this little blueprint how to make this small protein called the spike protein. So this gives your cells the ability to build this protein. So it comes in, they're little kind of organisms within, which are called ribosomes, which all they do is make a little protein. So they see this, they're like, ooh, this is a great piece of paper. It's telling me how to make this. It makes this protein. And then the messenger RNA gets tagged for destruction afterwards. So then you just have the protein, and then your body takes that protein and then it basically breaks it, chops it up, and it tries to make antibodies to different parts of that spike protein so that it can be ready no matter which side of the spike protein basically shows itself to your body. So these are kind of the steps that are happening. And also, mRNA is, yes, you're getting exposed to this in this vaccine, but I want you to also know when you get certain viruses, they actually expose you to their mRNA. And that's also how they work, because they have to make these proteins in your body. So when you catch a cold, most of the cold viruses expose you to their mRNA because they need your body to make them replicate their own viruses, because they need to replicate in a host. So you have been exposed to mRNA before. This is the first time we're using it in a vaccine, but your body has actually seen viral mRNA before. And what we're doing is we're limiting exactly how much viral mRNA you're getting. It only makes this little part of the virus. It will not make the whole virus. So you also can't get COVID-19 from the vaccine. So it only lets you make a small part of that virus. The rest of it, it's almost like saying, here's the blueprint to make a chair, but you can never make a whole dining room from that. You can only make the chair. So I hope that helps explain it a bit more in terms of mRNA, DNA, or DNA is protected, and the mRNA, which is used and then gets tagged for destruction.
Okay, so thank you so much, all four of you, our illustrious panelists. At this time, we're going to take some time out. We'll take a 10-minute break. So my clock is saying 2:06, so just about 2:15, 2:16, we'll be back to continue this very, very exciting, informative webinar. Timeout, thanks. Well, I think it's that time again. I think we are back. We're ready to resume. Wow, that 10, 15 minutes went by so quickly. And I see that we have quite a few questions from members who have attended the webinar. So what I'll do is I'll simply take the questions that have been posed to us and I'll throw them out. And, you know, anyone who feels like jumping in, just jump in, take the question, run with it and see where we go. So welcome back, everyone. We're in for the second half, the second segment of the webinar today. I think we've gone quite well so far. So I'll jump right in and begin with the first question. And let's see, it's linked to some of the information we've had before, but I'll bring it up again anyway, because it might not have been made clear earlier. Question: did they break the numbers down to show what percentage of the clinical studies of the over 30,000 plus were Blacks? Who wants to run with that one? Anybody?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this earlier. At least for the Pfizer.
What's happening here now?
Pfizer vaccine. Can you hear me?
Is everyone hearing me?
Yes.
Sorry, my bad. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yes, at least for the Pfizer and the Moderna and the AstraZeneca vaccines, there was a mix of different ethnicities. For Moderna, there were 10% Black, 20% Hispanic, 3% other ethnicities, and 63% white. For Pfizer, there were 80% white, 26% Hispanic or Latino, 9.8% African American, and 4.4% Asian. And there's less than 3% of other ethnicities. And for AstraZeneca, 75% were white, but 10.1% were Black, and 3.5% were Asian. So there's a fair mix of different ethnicities in these studies.
Right, thank you, Dr. Burt. And I'm going to try to mix this a bit because I see one here that is linked to some of what we've been talking about earlier on. Essentially, it's asking about the use of vitamins C, D, and zinc to fortify the immune system. I know we talked quite a bit about the immune system, but we didn't speak specifically about the use of these, let's say, supplements to fortify the immune system. So since that seems to be more along the naturopathic lines, I'll throw this one to Dr. Abdurrahman, and anybody can jump in after that.
Sorry, did you want me or did you want Dr. Todd to answer this?
Also, I'm sorry, Dr. Todd. I'm sorry about that. Dr. Todd, and then anybody can jump in. Thanks, you're very kind. I appreciate that.
Sure. So definitely there is a lot to be said about utilizing things like vitamin D, zinc, vitamin C, with respect to optimizing immune health. If people are taking these things, though, thinking that it's going to protect them from getting COVID, then that's simply not the case. So yeah, I do treat a lot of people and use these things, but you know, there isn't evidence to say that it's going to protect you from COVID-19. There have been studies done utilizing things like vitamin D, vitamin C, quercetin, and zinc, but these have all been done after somebody has gotten COVID. And that is, we're here to protect the population and try to prevent that and prevent the severity of it.
Wonderful, thank you. And that links directly or leads directly to the next question, sorry. And please don't just give a yes or no, anyone who is answering. It's simply, can you still get COVID-19 after getting the vaccine or after getting vaccination? Next part, and how did okay, we talked about the next part already, how it got developed so quickly. So let's stay with the first part. Can you still get COVID-19 after getting the vaccination? Anyone?
So I can take that, at least
thanks.
Anyone else can join. So after you get the vaccine, if you receive the Pfizer vaccine, the studies have shown that 95% reduction in infection with COVID-19. In addition, for Moderna, it was a reduction of 94.1% for infection. So yes, there still a small risk of having infection? Absolutely. So somewhere in around the 5 to 6% chance that you could still get COVID. But what was also great about these studies was when they looked at the few people who still got COVID-19 infection, they did not get the severe forms of COVID-19 infection, and they did not die of COVID-19. So yes, there's a small risk that you could still get the infection, even though you've had the full vaccination. So the two doses for these two vaccines, but the risk of having severe disease or dying from it was actually shown to be essentially nil for these patients. So, and this is not uncommon for any of the vaccines that we use now, in terms of, how much protection it gives us from infection. We do have great responses that we can see in, somewhere in the 70, 80 to 90% reduction of infection. But not all of them have shown actually as high as 94 and 95% in terms of the ones we use commonly on a day-to-day basis. And I think I'll just link one more thing to this, which was in the questions as well, was if you get the vaccine, could you pass on COVID from the vaccine? And like I mentioned, this only gives you a small portion of the protein to make and build antibodies to. It's not a live vaccine, so you cannot get COVID-19 from the vaccine. So you could not spread it just from having the vaccination. And I'll invite anyone else who wants to comment on this.
Any other panelists wants to jump in?
Yeah, just to add to that, and maybe this is going to come up a bit later, but I mean, there are variants out there, variant strains of the virus that causes COVID-19. And it's known that although most of the vaccines will protect you in terms of protecting you from severe disease, it's possible that you could be reinfected even after being vaccinated with the current vaccine. You could be exposed to a variant. And that's why, even though we have vaccines, and I think someone mentioned earlier that it's one of the tools in the toolbox, at this point, until we have herd immunity, that's until most people are immune, and until we know more about whether the vaccines can protect against these variants, it's really important to still maintain social distancing. And even though you've been vaccinated, wear a mask when you go out, follow the same safety precautions, because it is possible. And even if you've been vaccinated, if the vaccine's 70% protective, 80%, 90%, it means a proportion could still be infected. So we have to take precautions in terms of wearing masks, etc., even if we've been vaccinated.
Thank you so much. And we go to the next question. If an individual has existing severe environmental allergies, would getting vaccine trigger further adverse reactions? Who wants to go with that one?
I guess as the allergist, I can answer this question.
You're targeted today, huh? Okay.
So if you have, so what we've talked a lot about what's in the vaccine, but what I think it's important to mention is what's not in the vaccine. So there's no, none of these environmental allergens are in the vaccine. So there's no pollens, weeds, or bee venoms in the vaccine. And there's also no foods or dyes or latex. So none of these common allergens are in the vaccine. So they should not, so it's not going to be an issue if you have allergies to these other items. And even if you have severe allergies to things like, some of the spring pollens and such, having the vaccine will not affect that. And we as allergists recommend for all our patients to proceed once it is their turn, and it's not a contraindication for having kind of seasonal or pollen allergies or bee venom allergies or latex allergies to getting this vaccination. And as a society, our Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology also has a statement kind of reassuring all of those who have these kinds of allergies that is not a concern for this vaccination.
Anybody else, or should we move to another question? Okay, this one is a bit political and geopolitical, but I think in a way everything is economics and politics, so I'll throw it in here. And to members of the to attendees of the webinar, I'm not calling any names at the risk of not being able to pronounce some people's names correctly, but I don't think it's really important to mention the name of the person who asks the question. I'm not sure of the protocol that guides that, but I'll just not mention any names. You who've asked the question, you'll know who you are, and that's the important thing. So now, here we have, excuse me, something just flashed on the screen. Okay, it's gone. There are 3 other vaccines from Cuba. Why aren't these spoken of? Actually, only the ones made in the European and American labs are spoken of and highlighted as effective. Who would like to run with that one? The difference in treatment between Cuban developers and developers in the US and Europe.
Let me talk to that. I can talk to that a bit.
Yes, Trevor, thanks. Go ahead.
And one of the reasons why I can talk to that is because I actually did some work in Cuba for WHO and PAHO. And I mean, Cuba has some really good abilities. Actually, I spent some time with the Finley Institute in Cuba, and they were at the time they were working on a meningococcal vaccine, and it was really quite a good vaccine. And what they were looking at though is they were looking at trying to commercialize that vaccine, possibly in North America. Now that's a different ballgame. So that the bar for them to commercialize it in North America is, in the first case, it's political. Secondly, I mean, you have to have a good reason for trying to commercialize it in North America. But they were able to commercialize it within Latin America and in other countries because that was their aim. They wanted to have a homegrown vaccine, and they also wanted to make some money. So the reason why I mean, nobody's looking at Cuba for a COVID-19 vaccination, I mean, is a good question. And part of the reasons for that is that there is no political incentive to Cuba. For one thing, you need to have the same kind of levels of assurance that you'd want to have from a vaccine made in North America or Europe, for example. So how do you do that is the first question. I mean, the actual regulatory pathway would have to be the same. So they'd have to be able to demonstrate all the things that would normally demonstrate for a vaccine produced in Canada or the US or in Europe, that you could even license it or even get it to be used in any way in North America. So that's really the first issue, I think.
Wonderful. Coming from you, that's very important. Having had that experience of working in Cuba, I would, does anyone else want to touch on that, or should we move to another question? I think that's been effectively answered. Now, this one seems to have political, certainly financial implications as well. One of the conversations in the community in general centers around immunity from prosecution that some vaccine manufacturers supposedly have. For instance, I think it was in 1986 in the United States, vaccine manufacturers were able to receive immunity from prosecution should something go wrong with someone who's been vaccinated. At least that's part of the discourse that's taking place. So now this question relates directly to that, and it says, Pfizer has been involved in one of the largest health frauds in history, being involved in a $2.3 billion settlement. If vaccine manufacturers cannot be held liable, why should we trust these companies? And I think that has something to do with people's willingness to take or not take the vaccine. Who wants to jump in?
I can attempt to answer that question. And
Guys,
you know, it's a good point. We hear the term big pharma, and there's certain connotations that phrase has. You think of a number of situations where big pharma have been prosecuted and had to pay large fines. So I would first say that vaccines, the vaccine portfolio in a big pharmaceutical company is not the same as the portfolio, the drug portfolio.
No.
For instance, vaccines account for about 3% of the total sales of the pharma industry compared to drugs. And vaccines are a sort of, you know, Cinderella component of the sales of most vaccine companies. And now that might change now because of the pandemic, but that's what's happened. That's what the case has been in the past. And so, for instance, the sales of a blood thinning drug like, you know, Lipitor, one of those, but is more than the total sales normally of the world vaccine market. So a single blood thinner has a larger market and more sales than the total vaccine market. And that means that there's a lot of pressure on drug companies, a lot of competition to push their drugs, to advertise. And yes, there's been a lot of abuse, misadvertising, false advertising, advertising their drug for use when it hasn't really been indicated. But that doesn't happen for vaccines because it's a different commodity. It's part of our health, government health process, where the government actually recognizes that we need vaccines, and so it's clear that the advertising doesn't have to be so heavy. So the abuses aren't necessarily there for vaccines. And the other part of the question is the exemption from liability. And this is true, especially in the case of a pandemic. Vaccine companies are asked to develop vaccines. And in terms of a pandemic like we're in now, they're asked to focus all of their efforts on developing a vaccine, put all their resources onto it. And so they've asked that they're not liable in this, this extensive push to get a vaccine out. They're not liable for any rare adverse events that may take place down the road. So governments, in order for governments to make sure they get a good supply of vaccine, they've basically agreed that the company itself will not be liable. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the governments aren't ensuring that the vaccines are safe, because I think this is what the perception is. Because the companies aren't liable, there's an assumption that the vaccines, they might be hiding something in terms of the safety. That's not true. The regulatory authorities are very careful, and if a vaccine doesn't meet the criteria of safety and efficacy, it will not be authorized or licensed. Now, indirectly, companies do pay for and are liable in a way. For instance, there's a national vaccine injury compensation program in the US, and 75 cents of the cost of each dose of a vaccine that's made is subject to a tax. So the company has to pay a tax. And this money goes into a fund that is used to pay for any rare adverse events that might be seen down the road caused by a vaccine. So indirectly, the companies are paying, they're contributing these amounts of funds towards this trust, so that anyone who's had a vaccine related injury can go to one of the boards that look into these things and can be compensated if there's a correlation between the injury and the vaccine. So there are a number of reasons why governments allow companies to be exempt from liability, but companies do pay indirectly. Of course, they may add that amount to the price of the vaccine eventually, but there is a liability in terms of the excise tax.
There's one other thing to add to that, just quickly, and that is companies do not release vaccine lots to the market by themselves. They all go through the process that's taken for Schedule D drugs. And in the case of vaccines, they're all released on a lot by lot release basis by the regulatory authority after the company has done their own internal release. So clearly there's, the liability would have to be spread in that case.
Thank you both. Dr. Todd, Dr. Abdurrahman, any comment there, or should we move on to another one? Okay, then it seems as though we are staying with this political, along this economic political line for a bit. And in this highly bifurcated world, especially where race is concerned, these people's anxieties seem to be at a height in the face of this corona onslaught. The next one says, the president of Madagascar claimed to have found a treatment that works, found this treatment earlier this year. Now this one is directed at the task force. Is the task force working with other countries to study alternate therapies? Would anyone be able to answer that, or is that outside the purview of the...
Well, let's just clarify one thing. You say alternate therapies. You're not talking about other, as cures for the vaccine?
Well, I've read the question as the person has put it forward, so you all may have to interpret it or, enlighten somewhat as to what the person might mean by that.
Right. So just one comment. It's not only vaccines that are being used to respond to COVID, for example. There are other therapies that are, and every day I'm hearing about some other potential therapy, which could at least reduce the effects of having an infection. We just heard about one maybe a couple of weeks ago out of Quebec, the colchicine story. I haven't heard much about it lately. But there are all kinds of things that are popping up. And there's one I just saw, I was just looking at a couple of days ago. There's a nasal spray now. Yes. Right. So there are a number of therapies that are in development, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more too, because at least if nothing else, they could reduce the effects of an infection if you use them at the right time, I suppose. But in terms of what's coming out of Madagascar, that's a totally different story. Who knows what that is?
Similar to Cuba, do you think some of the same factors might be involved?
Well, what I can say is Cuba has a pretty strong emphasis on their biologics program. They've had that for a very long time. It was one of their, they put a lot of effort into that. So even though they weren't getting much support from in North America, they were getting support from Europe because they were getting a lot of equipment from, and so they were able to do a lot of good work for what based on resources that they could get. So I don't know about any other magic therapies in Cuba, but they do fairly good work on vaccines.
All right, thank you. Let's shift a bit. This one, after getting the vaccine, is there a period of time during which you're contagious? I think that's how it came across. After getting the vaccine, is there a period of time during which you're contagious? Does that seem like a,
earlier.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I answered this earlier, just it's not a live vaccine. So you cannot develop the infection from the vaccine. So you cannot be contagious based on just having the vaccine. So if you're worried about having the infection from the vaccine, then that wouldn't be a concern. Are you still susceptible to getting COVID is a bit different. Based on the studies, after you receive the first 2 vaccines, it's only about 7 to 10 days after your second dose. Are you fully immunized? Are you considered to be getting the protection of the vaccine to the 94 to 95% that were quoted? So before you're fully immunized and before kind of that 7 to 10 day period after your second vaccine, you're still susceptible, although the studies did show it was lower than those who were not. There's that, but just from having the vaccine itself would not make you contagious because it is not a live vaccine. So you're not shedding virus from getting the vaccine.
Thanks very much. Let's shift gears a bit. This one I saw earlier on, then I missed it, then it's come up again. There's the matter of some concerns that placentia might be in the vaccine. There's a lot of talk about the ingredients, and I know that this one has circulated quite a bit. Is there placentia in the vaccine? And while you're addressing that, you might address the debate around the presence of aluminum and I think mercury in the vaccines as well. Anybody,
yes, okay.
please feel free to jump in. So placentia, and then you may extend it to mercury and aluminum.
Okay, and I'll try and address this question in relation to some other questions that have come up in terms of what's in the vaccine. And we know categorically that none of the vaccines, especially the RNA vaccines from Pfizer or Moderna that have been authorized for use in Canada, they don't use any types of cells during their manufacture. So no vaccines are manufactured using, and I saw this on the chat as well, human stem cells or placenta. These are not in the vaccines. And I think linking it to another issue that always comes up is the issue of fetal tissue in the vaccines. And I think this is a question that many people have had. And again, the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, they're not manufactured using any types of cells. However, the AstraZeneca DNA vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, these vaccines are basically delivered. So the DNA of these vaccines is delivered using a virus called adenovirus. It's a virus that causes common cold. And viruses, to grow, they need cells. So viruses need cells to grow. They need to use the cell machinery to replicate themselves and make copies of themselves. So the adeno-DNA viruses, or vaccines, sorry, have to be grown on cells in order to produce large amounts so that you could use these for vaccines. And like many other vaccines that we've used for decades, often these cells that are used to grow the virus on are derived from sometimes kidney cells or lung cells that came from aborted human fetuses. Now these cells, these fetal cells, were derived from the 60s and the 70s, and they've been used in the manufacture of vaccines because they have this ability to divide and replicate millions and millions of times. They're almost immortal. So that if you're manufacturing a vaccine and you have to make sure the quality is the same, and that vaccine that you make today is the same as the one you make next year or the one you make next month, these cells are useful because they're exactly the same cells as were derived from these fetal tissues from the 1960s and 70s. Now, vaccines manufactured using these cells, like the rubella vaccine in the past, they've been shown to be completely safe after decades of use. No new abortions are being done to produce cells to manufacture these vaccines. And the original abortions, in fact, were not performed to develop the vaccines. Now, some individuals may have a moral issue in terms of, should I be taking a vaccine that has used fetal cells to manufacture them? And in fact, most faith groups support the use of these vaccines because they're linked to the 60s and 70s, that original abortion. It's a distant link. And most faith groups feel that because millions of lives have been saved by these vaccines, it's ethical to take them. However, there are alternatives. And as I said, the mRNA vaccines are not manufactured in cells. And many COVID vaccines that are coming down the pipeline are based on proteins, the S protein. They're not manufactured in any type of fetal cell. And I think we have to remember that, and there's no fetal tissue in these vaccines because, cells make tissue. Tissues are not cells. Cells are the minute components that together, and when they develop, form tissues. But these vaccines that use these cells are only grown in the cells, then they're purified, and there's no trace of that material left in the vaccine.
Right. Thank you, David.
And I'll add one thing.
Yes, please.
Just the other part that you mentioned. So like Dr. Burt already said, there's no fetal cells or placenta or any of these tissues used in the mRNA vaccines. And you know what else is not in the mRNA vaccines? There is no alum or aluminum. There is no dyes. There is no thimerosal or mercury containing compounds. So none of those are in these vaccines.
Thank you.
Just to clarify, the mercury will be there as a preservative in the first place, right? And that's another additional feature of these vaccines. They do not contain preservative.
Oh, okay. Again, information, knowledge, so important. This one comes from a dentist. I think it's a 4-part question. He says, or she says, in my practice, in my dental practice, myself and staff get tested for COVID-19 voluntarily every 2 weeks to protect our patients. We plan on getting the vaccine soon. Should we still continue to test regularly after this? Are benefits to, just a minute now, benefits to, as a medical practitioner working with patients, to be, I think he means or she means, are there benefits as a medical practitioner working with patients to be tested this frequently? And the last part, are there any risks involved in frequent testing? Who wants to jump in on that one?
I can start, and then if others want to join in, that would be great. So currently, what I can tell you is with the current vaccines that we have available in Canada, we know about their reduction in terms of you getting infection. They're currently doing further studies to see if there is any risks that you could potentially still carry the virus, like in your nares, you not get infected, but is there any possibility of still transmitting it? So those studies are still being done, there's hopefully going to be more data about transmissibility of it. So because I cannot tell you 100% you will not have the potential to transmit, if that is the reason for which you're doing the screening, then at this point, we don't have the data to tell you to perhaps stop these measures if that is part of it. What I can tell you is in certain groups or certain areas of practice, for example, in long-term care, we are routinely testing those who work there in terms of our nurses, PSWs, the ward clerks, different people who work in those settings, because those patients are particularly vulnerable. Those healthcare workers are routinely tested weekly or bi-weekly to help kind of reduce the possibility of someone carrying it asymptomatically. So, and there hasn't been any kind of increased risk from that, and they've been doing that for a while now. But at this point, from what the reason you're doing it seems to be because of potential of asymptomatic transmission. We do not have the data yet to tell you about transmissibility after you've been vaccinated, but we hope that that information will be coming out soon.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I would add that it also gives your patients some reassurance if you can tell them that you've been tested regularly, because a lot of people are reluctant to go to the dentist and to get routine medical treatment because of that. But if you can tell them that yes, we're tested, we've been vaccinated, but we're still testing ourselves, I think that would really reassure your patients and encourage them to attend and get their teeth sorted out.
I saw that smile. It's good to have a little levity. I wasn't expecting you cracked me up. Okay. Okay, let me go. Oh boy, that was sneaky. Yeah, okay, crept up with me. Okay, this one comes from, we're trying to make sure everybody gets represented here. This one comes, it has religious meaning. A straight question. What do you say to those who choose not to vaccinate because of religion? And if you want to touch that one, or I think it deserves an answer, even if it's a suggestion. I know it's not science-based, but it's part of our existence.
I mean, I think there's not going to be one right answer to this, and I'm sure everyone will be able to comment. I think that you have to ask the person. You can, if that's your family member, if it's someone that you trust, you can also ask them about kind of what their concerns are from the religious aspect. What I can tell you for both the vaccines that are currently available, I know just looking at some of the American data when they also were kind of proceeding in terms of education, the Muslim associations in the US have certified the vaccines as halal. Similarly, they've been certified as kosher in the US. And a lot of different heads of faith groups have also kind of given blessings for it. So is it that you'd have to really explore what it is within the aspect of faith? Maybe there was a concern about fetal cells, maybe there's other concerns. So I think you'd really have to figure out where it is. And maybe it is to kind of let them know to check within kind of their faith leaders, because a lot of them have been supportive of the vaccine. But this is really, there's not going to be one thing with faith, right? So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on how else to approach this.
Yeah, I think you've covered it well. I know in terms of the fetal tissue, it's a big concern, especially for Catholics. But in fact, the Pope and the Catholic leadership have basically agreed that, again, because of the link, the distal link between the cells that are used for some vaccines today and those original abortions in the 60s and 70s, that they believe that it's beneficial to take these vaccines because of the lives that have been saved. And it just depends on yeah, your view, what your particular ethical or moral situation is with vaccines. I mean, I know a lot of religious groups are they're focused on natural remedies, and so often they're analyzing what's in the vaccine, what components are there. But I think we've already mentioned that, especially these mRNA vaccines, they're very simple. They don't contain preservatives or any of the substances that have come under scrutiny in the past.
All right. Now we should be wrapping up pretty soon. It's now 2:56, but I don't know whether we are permitted to, you know, a little 5 minutes over or so. We'll see how that goes. But again, this one is related to religion in a way. It comes from a vegan perspective, from a vegan audience member. Wants to know if the vaccine was tested on animals. It might seem simple, it might seem insignificant, but direct. They would like to know, has the vaccine been tested on animals?
Yes, they have to be tested on animals before being tested in humans. Part of the research and the development of vaccines involves testing on animals, and especially animals that are susceptible to the particular disease that you're trying to protect against. And there's one stage in that process that is very critical, and these are called toxicity studies, GLP toxicity studies. These are done in independent labs, not in the same lab that is developing the vaccine or the company. These are done in independent labs, and they're done in a very rigorous manner. You need to, obviously, you want to make sure your vaccine that is going to be given to millions of humans is going to be safe. And so these toxicity studies are done in a way where you give the animal doses that are far exceeding those of what a human would get. And you look at every aspect of the animal's physiology, blood work, etc. Now, this is so that we can at least have a fair predictability that this vaccine is going to be safe and can start to be tested in humans. Now, for a vegan, and I guess the questioner is saying, are there other ways in which we can test vaccines without using animals? And really, there are cellular assays that you can use. But as I've mentioned before, a cell is not a complete tissue or complete organism. And it's very difficult to basically translate that data from a cell to a human. And in science, we even have this phrase that says, mice lie. A lot of research is done in mice. But you may have a fantastic vaccine in mice that fails in humans. And we always say that mice lie. You can't, even an organism you can't really believe until you've done the study. So unfortunately, there aren't ways that have been developed enough to be able to say we can do away with animal studies this time.
And it's worth mentioning too that, you know, over the years, certainly over the last couple of decades, there's been a fairly intense effort to reduce the amount of testing in animals. And you know, for things like potency tests, you can probably achieve that a lot earlier than things like the tox tests. But but right now, I mean, there is always going to be some testing in animals, at least until someone really comes up with a good alternative for many of the tests. At least in the case of the mRNA vaccines, it's quite likely that you won't need as much testing in animals because, you know, I'm not sure what they're releasing them on, but you know, they probably don't need the same kind of tests as you do with a vaccine where you need to evaluate potency.
Well, 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 would you believe it's been 2 hours, a little over 2 hours. And at this point, I'm going to wrap things up. To members of the audience, if you have not had your questions answered this time around, you may have the opportunity at another webinar having to deal with this topic. So at this point, I must thank our panelists, or illustrious panelists, Dr. Zainab Abdurrahman, Trevor Aldridge, Dr. Candice Todd, and Dr. David Burt. On behalf of the Harriet Tubman Institute at York University, Glendon College, the Robarts Library, the task force, the Black Scientist Task Force, City of Toronto. I hope I've included everyone here. I think diversity talk as well. My colleagues, Dr. Meanda, or administrator, tech administrator, Ika Washington, Chantal Symes, Trevor Francis, Akwatu Kenti. Thank you all for your contribution that has made this such an informative and useful dialogue to have, coming again from a Black perspective. This is, I think this is crucial, because we all have a role to play in allaying fears and concerns as far as this vaccine, or I would say as far as the approach to Corona or COVID-19 is concerned. Thank you all. Thank you very, very much. I have learned a lot, and it's been a privilege, a pleasure for me to moderate and to try to feel comfortable amongst such immense knowledge, professional knowledge. Have a great weekend, all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Henry, before we go.
Yes, Dr. Kenti, yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few words to thank people.
By all means.
Yes, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all our guests and participants. You know, your health and well-being brought you here today, and it's always better to gather for prevention than to gather for cure. You know, I can't tell you that enough. I also want to say a special big up to the panelists for 2 hours, 3 hours. It's not easy just to be taking questions. You know, there wasn't any studying last night. You didn't have homework to prepare you for the questions. So we really appreciate your putting yourself out like this, and, you know, taking it on like this. It's a huge challenge, and we're all doing it for the same reasons, really. We want to see all communities across this wider Canadian society get past COVID, but we especially want to see Black communities, of which we are a part, get through this, and not just get through it, but be better off at the end of it. I have to say a special thank you to some of the people who have made it possible, particularly the leadership of Taibu Community Health Center, the City of Toronto, Harriet Tubman Institute, the Canadian Multicultural Inventors Museum.
Not the dog, right? Not the dog. I think the dog is upset because it's not been tested.
I'm bringing the dog. Put the dog. Anyway, I say a special note of thanks to the City of Toronto and to all of you. And I do it because the positions that we are taking are not universally appreciated or endorsed. And many people have taken exception to what we are doing, thinking that some of us may have vested interests or secret interests. But I can assure everyone who is listening that our intentions really is to reduce positivity rates, reduce hospitalization rates, and save lives. And, you know, seeing the leadership of the city, seeing the leadership of Taibu Community Health Center, seeing the leadership of Harriet Tubman Institute and Canadian Multicultural Inventors Museum, stepping forward, taking the risks to advance the cause, should be heartwarming. If it isn't heartwarming, I urge you to think again. I also never want to leave an event like this, given it's Black History Month, but also given the very real challenges that our communities face across this country and indeed across the world, especially in places where they don't have access to the vaccine, where it's a different kind of equity issue that should be relevant to us as people of African descent, wherever we are. So I also want to pay acknowledgement to the African ancestors, and in particular to Onesimus, who you may not know about, but he was an enslaved African living in Boston in 1721. And the person who, I put in quotation marks, who owned him, a guy named, a priest named Cotton Mather, learned from him the practice of inoculation that was taking place in West Africa in what probably was Ghana. So they called him Onesimus. His name could have been Kwame, we don't know. But Onesimus or Kwame told Cotton Mather that back in Africa, in his village, when they had smallpox, they would walk around the village, they would take something from someone who was sick, stick a little, take the pus and walk around and stick people. And that's how he was protected. And Cotton Mather didn't believe him at first, but then he went and he interviewed other enslaved Africans and became convinced that this was divine providence, and convinced another doctor, a guy named Royston, to do something, to take a test. And it's so funny. Back then, there was a huge misinformation campaign against him. They were saying, you're bringing this from Africa, from pagan Africa. It's demonic, it's fetishes, and people pelted stuff through his church window. But time proved him right in terms of taking that risk and doing what he did. And time is very important because African people have endured quite a bit. And I just wanted to show you how far we've come by going back 100 years and referencing Booker T. Washington, who started something in 1915 called National Negro Health Week to boost public health. And he said, and I quote, "Health was the building block upon which everything else rested: political rights, economic self-sufficiency, even citizenship. If you don't have health, you can't be a good citizen. You can't practice citizenship. You will not be economically self-sufficient, and you won't be able to attain your political rights." And Marcus Mosiah Garvey took that up. He endorsed that idea. He supported that idea. And we have come a long way since 1915, but we still have a long way to go. So bear that in mind as you go through this Black History Month. We'll try to answer the questions online through the week. So those of you whose questions didn't get answered, don't think we're not going to make the effort to answer the questions. And we invite you to invite others. The next town hall will be sponsored by Women's Health and Women's Hands. It's next week, Saturday. And we hope to get over some of these technological glitches that a few people experienced today. And once again, thanks to everyone for joining us today and taking time out of your Saturdays. And thanks to our panelists for taking time out of their Saturdays. All the best, stay safe. Talk to you next week. Oh, sorry.
Wonderful.
Dr. Mianda, did you want to say something before we close?
Just echo what you just said. What can I say more? Just thank you, our panelists, for taking time. We know how busy they can be, but taking time to talk to your community, it shows how the love of your community. And we thank you very much.
Okay, you're very welcome. Take care. All right. Have a nice afternoon, all of you.
Wonderful. Okay.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.